And now for more on the broader political implications of this year's election, we're joined today by John Delury, visiting research fellow at Ewha Women's University and senior fellow at the Asia Society. Dr. Delury, thanks for coming in today.
Yeah, pleasure.
So for the sake of our viewers overseas, could you just briefly tell us a bit about Korea's current local elections and why they matter?
Yeah, well, your correspondents have been explaining very well a lot of what is at stake. Of course, as a local election, it's not going to have quite the same international impact as a presidential election or parliamentary election, but it is an indicator of where the country is heading. It's also a chance to test the strength of the democratic system itself, and we'll be talking, I'm sure, about voter turnout. That's one of the most important indicators, even before we know the results. So it's a chance to take a look, I would say, at the health of the democracy, and then also get some indicators going forward in terms of party politics and maybe some personalities who could be emerging from this election who will be important down the road.
Right, so Korea saw a record voter turnout during the 2 days of early voting last week. So both parties are interpreting the high turnout very differently. How could the strong early voting turnout affect the outcome of the election? And could it lead to a high voter turnout on the election day today?
It was hard to, do the analytics and extrapolate from early voter turnout to say who's going to win this election or that election. And I think there is increasing evidence, maybe in Korea and more broadly, that it's not the best indicator of a winner. Although, as you say, probably each party is going to, see the result that they hope in the statistics. I think at this point what we can say is it is very encouraging to see the high percentage of early voter turnout, and also so far in your reporting that today is going well, and maybe the election overall will exceed previous years. I think that's really the key number, is when you look at the composite turnout rate. There are all kinds of reasons that people might vote early. Practical reasons that don't have anything to do with party politics or issues, and those trends can really shift every 4 years. And so I think we should be hesitant about extrapolating from those percentages. Again, the important thing, I think the broader significance, is that the turnout rate looks high, and what that tells us is that South Korean citizens do have faith in their democratic system. They may be happy with things and want to keep incumbents in charge, happy with things and want to get rid of incumbents and send a positive message about the presidential administration, the ruling party. They may be unhappy with things, but even if they're unhappy, they are going to vote to register their frustration or disappointment. So that is a very good indicator that wherever you're falling on the political spectrum and wherever you're feeling about how things are going in terms of the direction of the country, people are voting. People think it's meaningful to vote.
Right, absolutely. And what's also important is that this is the first national election under President Lee Jae-myung, right? And so could the results be interpreted abroad as a barometer of public support for the administration's policies?
I think inevitably, in terms of international coverage and outside, governments, non-Koreans looking at this election, inevitably, whether it's true or not, there's going to be an inference that this is a kind of referendum on President Lee Jae-myung. That's what's going to happen, because when you try to get from local issues to, okay, what's the national and international significance, the first thing that people are going to look at is, did the Democratic Party, did the president's party do well, do really well in these elections? And if so, that's going to be seen as a referendum. Of course, what we're seeing in terms of international coverage is that his polling numbers are very high. And so he's widely perceived as a strong president. And so this election will be another test. On the flip side, if the Democratic Party does not do well, then that is going to lead to international perception of something's off, something's wrong, maybe he's weaker than was thought. So yeah, I think at the international perspective, it's inevitably perceived as some kind of referendum on the president.
Right. And beyond deciding local leadership, what broader political implications could the results have on the ruling and opposition parties at the National Assembly?
Well, there's a lot of complicated dynamics happening on both the conservative and liberal side. I would say it seems, especially as a foreigner trying to follow these things, I think for foreign audiences it's especially complex understanding what is happening with the conservative opposition party, just because obviously last year they really imploded with the impeachment of a president who had shocked the country and frankly shocked the world by declaring martial law. So there's still, I think, a lot of questions about what's the future of the conservative, movement and the main conservative party, the PPP. So I think there will be a lot of attention, including by foreign observers, to try to read this election to see what is the fate of Korean conservatism. So I think there'll be a lot of scrutiny to some of the elections that you've been talking about as indicators of where that's heading. And of course, with the election here in Seoul of the mayor, which is a nationally prominent and even internationally prominent position. Seoul is one of the world's first cities, and the mayor of Seoul does have a certain international platform. Whichever party that figure is from will also be something that, again, at a global level, will get some attention. I think it's a little more orderly on the liberal end because you do have a popular president, for the Democratic Party in Lee Jae-myung, who looks to have, consolidated his strength fairly well. But again, we'll have to see the results of these elections and if there's new questions that emerge in terms of the future of the Democratic Party. But I do think there's a lot more attention about the conservative side of the ledger.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. And more on that, to what extent will foreign governments and international audiences be watching these election results? What conclusions might they draw from these results?
Well, I think we have to be realistic here in terms of foreign governments. Of course, they'll be monitoring this election, but in the hierarchy of Korean elections, you have the presidential election, you have the National Assembly, parliamentary elections, and you have the local elections. So I've seen international coverage. The New York Times, for example, wrote up something, a preliminary report, and there will be more at that level in terms of paying attention to it. But still, I think foreign governments fully understand that this is not a national election, and so they're not going to overdraw their conclusions about what it means. I think another international audience that's interesting to consider is not so much about governments, but about citizens globally. We are living in a moment of history where there are serious doubts about the future of democracy itself. And if you do, look at some of the research by political scientists, by civic organizations, again, globally, there's real serious indicators about backsliding, democratic backsliding, loss of confidence that liberal democracies have in their own systems. And so in that sense, I think this election and Korea in general is very important. Korea has a lot of soft power, as we all know. And it's not just limited to music and TV and film. It's also about the political system. And so showing the health, the vitality, the integrity, for all its flaws, like every democracy, of the system, I think that's an important global significance of today. I think there are civic groups who monitor democracy are going to be paying attention to this election.
Right. So do these election results have any implications for Seoul's approach toward North Korea, perhaps, or other foreign policy challenges, especially if they are viewed as a referendum on the administration's broader policy direction?
Yeah, I think, in terms specifically of the North Korea challenge, that's a huge challenge. That is a national challenge, and that's not something that locally elected officials have too much room to move on. If things were to improve in the inter-Korean space, you could see, and we've seen in the past, we saw in 2018, for example, when the relationship was better between the two Koreas, you can start to see provincial and mayoral level engagement, between the two Koreas. So that's one space to watch. I wouldn't say that's going to happen anytime soon, but down the road, if things changed at the high political level, you could see local involvement, local governments getting involved in that way. Otherwise, I think, again, to a point we've been talking about, the overall strength of President Lee Jae-myung, if his party does well today, that's going to strengthen his hand in international negotiations, in navigating what is obviously very difficult circumstances for South Korea, dealing with the alliance with the United States, dealing with the economic pressure coming from the Trump administration, tariffs and trade war, dealing with with China, with this big, powerful neighbor who Korea has a strong economic relationship, but a complicated overall strategic relationship with. So anything that strengthens the hand of the president will make it a little bit easier for the administration to navigate some of those challenges.
Right, absolutely. All right, we'll have to see how that goes. Dr. Delury, thank you so much for coming in today. We appreciate it.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.